Quinn Taggert had not expected to find anyone beneath the sprawling oak tree that stood at the edge of his property, especially not a woman in a pale blue dress reading a leather-bound book, as if she had been waiting there her whole life. The July sun blazed overhead in the Wyoming sky, casting dappled shadows through the thick canopy of leaves, and for a moment he simply sat atop his horse, watching her with a mixture of confusion and curiosity that made his chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. She looked up from her page when his horse shifted its weight, the leather saddle creaking in the quiet afternoon. Her eyes were the color of honey in sunlight, warm and steady as they met his gaze without fear or hesitation. Most women in Sweetwater would have startled at finding themselves alone with a stranger, but this one simply marked her place with a finger and waited. "Afternoon," Quinn said, tipping his hat. His voice came out rougher than intended, dust from the trail still coating his throat. "This is private property, miss." "I know," she replied, her voice carrying a slight accent he could not quite place, something Eastern perhaps, refined but not pretentious. "I have been waiting for you." Quinn dismounted, his boots hitting the packed earth with a soft thud. He was 26 years old, tall and lean from years of ranch work, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the pale blue of a winter sky. The statement should have concerned him more than it did, but something in her expression suggested she meant no harm. Still, a man did not survive long in Wyoming territory in 1878 without maintaining a healthy sense of caution. "Waiting for me." He looped his horse's reins around a low branch. "I do not believe we have met, miss." "We have not." She closed her book carefully, running her palm across the worn cover with obvious affection. "My name is Margaret Oakes. I arrived in Sweetwater 3 days ago on the stage from Cheyenne. I have been coming here every afternoon since then. To my tree." It was not really a question. "I did not know it belonged to anyone in particular." Margaret stood, brushing dust from her skirts. She was perhaps 22 or 23, with dark auburn hair pinned up in a simple style, and a scattering of freckles across her nose that suggested she had spent considerable time outdoors despite her ladylike appearance. The woman at the boarding house mentioned that a good man lived out this way, someone who valued land and loyalty and keeping his word. She said if anyone in this territory would understand what I need, it would be the cowboy who owns the ranch with the old oak tree. Quinn felt something shift in his chest, a strange mixture of wariness and hope that he had learned to suppress years ago. "Mrs. Henderson talks too much. She seemed to think you could use some company." Margaret's smile was gentle, without coyness or calculation. "She also mentioned that you have not been to town except for supplies in nearly 3 months. I have a ranch to run." Quinn crossed his arms, aware that he sounded defensive. "Cattle do not tend themselves." "No, I suppose they do not." Margaret looked past him toward the distant mountains, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. "This is beautiful country, harsh but honest. I find I prefer that to the alternative." There was a story there, Quinn could tell. He had learned to read people during his years in Wyoming, first as a hired hand, and then as a ranch owner through sheer determination and back-breaking work. Margaret Oakes carried herself with the bearing of someone who had known comfort, but had also learned hard lessons. Her dress was well made but not new, her hands smooth but not soft. Whatever had brought her to Sweetwater, it was not simple adventure or romantic notions of the West. "What exactly do you need, Miss Oakes?" Quinn kept his voice neutral, though his curiosity was thoroughly engaged now. "A fresh start." She met his eyes directly, and perhaps someone who understands that the past does not have to define the future. The words struck deeper than Quinn expected. He had come to Wyoming 5 years ago for exactly those reasons, fleeing a family legacy in Missouri that had demanded he become someone he could not respect. His father had wanted him to join the business of buying up foreclosed farms from desperate families, profiting from their misfortune. Quinn had chosen poverty and honest work instead, breaking with his family entirely. "That is a conversation that requires more than standing in the heat," he said finally. "Would you care to come up to the house? I can offer water at least and some coffee if you do not mind it strong." Margaret's smile deepened, transforming her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "I would like that very much, Mr. Taggert. Quinn, please." He offered his arm, a gesture that felt both natural and strange after so long alone. "If we are having conversations about fresh starts, we might as well begin with honest names. Then you must call me Margaret." She tucked her book under one arm and accepted his support, though she moved across the uneven ground with surprising confidence. "Or Maggie, which is what my brother always called me." They walked toward the ranch house, a modest structure of weathered wood that Quinn had expanded himself over the past 2 years. It was not much compared to the grand homes in cities back east, but it was solid and well built, with a wide porch that caught the evening breeze and windows positioned to maximize light without making the interior too hot during summer. Inside, the main room held simple furniture Quinn had constructed himself, and a stone fireplace that provided welcome warmth during the brutal Wyoming winters. Books lined one wall, a collection he had built slowly over the years, reading by lamplight after long days of work. Margaret noticed them immediately, her expression brightening. "You are a reader," she said, moving toward the shelves with obvious interest. "Mrs. Henderson failed to mention that. Most people in Sweetwater do not consider it worth mentioning." Quinn moved to the kitchen area, pumping water into a kettle and setting it on the stove. Practical skills matter more than literature when you are trying to keep cattle alive through a blizzard. But you value both. Margaret pulled a volume from the shelf, handling it with the same care she had shown her own book. "Whitman. I would not have expected to find Leaves of Grass in a ranch house in Wyoming. A man can rope a steer and still appreciate poetry." Quinn found himself smiling despite his usual reserve. "Though I would appreciate it if you did not spread that around town. I have a reputation to maintain." Margaret laughed, a genuine sound of delight that filled the sparse room like music. "Your secret is safe with me." As Quinn prepared coffee, Margaret settled into one of the wooden chairs near the table, her book resting in her lap. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. For the first time in months, Quinn felt the oppressive loneliness that had become his constant companion begin to ease. "You mentioned a brother," he said, setting 2 tin cups on the table along with the coffee pot. "Is he here in Wyoming as well?" The light in Margaret's eyes dimmed. "Thomas died 2 years ago. Consumption. He was only 19. "I am sorry." Quinn sat across from her, meaning it. He had lost friends to disease, accidents, and violence during his years in the West. Death was an unwelcome but familiar presence. "He was a good person, the best I have known." Margaret wrapped her hands around the cup Quinn filled, though the day was too warm to need the heat. "After he passed, I found myself unable to remain in Boston. Too many memories, too many expectations about what a young woman should do with her life. Let me guess." Quinn took a careful sip of the bitter coffee. "Marriage to someone suitable, a quiet life managing a household, never causing trouble or expressing opinions. You understand, then?" Margaret's smile was sad. "My parents meant well, but they could not comprehend that I needed something different. Thomas always encouraged me to think for myself, to read widely, to question convention. After he died, Continuing to do those things felt like the only way to honor his memory. So you came west, eventually. Margaret took a drink of coffee and did not flinch at the strength, which Quinn found oddly admirable. First, I tried teaching in a girls' school, but my methods were considered too progressive. Then I worked as a clerk in a bookshop, but the owner found it unseemly to have an unmarried woman handling the accounts. Each opportunity closed because I would not conform to what was expected. And someone told you Wyoming might be more forgiving. Quinn was beginning to understand the shape of her story, the familiar outline of a life that did not fit into conventional spaces. A customer at the bookshop had a cousin in Cheyenne. She wrote letters describing the territory, the openness of it, the possibility. She said that in the West, people cared more about what you could do than who your family was or whether you observed all the proper social forms. Margaret's expression grew distant. It sounded like exactly what I needed. Wyoming can be brutal, Quinn warned, though he understood the appeal she described. Winters are harsh, towns are few and far between, and the law is not always reliable. It is not the romantic frontier that Eastern newspapers describe. I do not want romance, Mr. Taggert. Quinn. Margaret's eyes locked on his with surprising intensity. I want honesty. I want the chance to build a life based on my own choices and efforts. I want to matter because of what I contribute, not because of how well I manage to be decorative and silent. Quinn felt something stir in his chest, a recognition that went beyond mere sympathy. Here was someone who understood the same restlessness that had driven him from Missouri, the same refusal to accept a life that felt like slow suffocation. In that moment, sitting in his simple ranch house with the afternoon stretching toward evening, he knew that finding Margaret under his oak tree was going to change everything. "What did you mean earlier?" he asked quietly, "when you said you had been waiting for someone like me?" Margaret set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "Mrs. Henderson told me about you. Not just that you own a ranch and keep to yourself, but that you are fair and honest. That when the widow Patterson needed help bringing in her hay last fall, you organized the neighboring ranchers without expecting payment. That you have never cheated anyone in a deal, even when you could have. That you came here with nothing and built something through work rather than taking advantage of others." She paused, her voice softening. "She said you were the kind of man who understands that a person's character matters more than their circumstances. Mrs. Henderson has an excessive faith in my virtues." Quinn felt heat rise to his face, uncomfortable with the praise. "Does she?" Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Then tell me, Quinn Taggert, why did you invite a strange woman into your home based only on her word that she needed a fresh start? Why did you not send me away from your tree or report me to the town marshal for trespassing?" Quinn considered this. "Because I saw someone reading Tennyson under an oak tree in the middle of Wyoming summer heat, and thought that anyone dedicated enough to literature to do that probably was not looking to cause trouble." "It was Byron, actually," Margaret corrected with a smile. "But the principle stands." They talked as the afternoon faded into evening, conversation flowing with surprising ease. Quinn found himself sharing things he had not spoken of in years: his conflict with his family, his determination to build something meaningful in Wyoming, his love for this harsh and beautiful land. Margaret told him about Thomas, about her frustration with the limitations placed on women, about her hope that the West might offer opportunities unavailable in Boston society. When the light began to fail, Quinn reluctantly stood. "I should ride you back to town. It is not safe to travel after dark, even this close to Sweetwater." "Will I see you again?" Margaret's question held no coyness, only genuine interest. "I have supplies to pick up tomorrow," Quinn heard himself say. "I could stop by Mrs. Henderson's boarding house around midday if you would like to walk with me. There is a spot by the creek worth seeing." "I would like that very much." Quinn saddled his horse and helped Margaret mount, then swung up behind her. The ride to town took nearly an hour, the summer dusk painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Margaret fit against him naturally, her back straight but relaxed, and Quinn found himself acutely aware of her presence, the faint scent of lavender in her hair, the warmth of her even through the layers of fabric. Sweetwater was quiet when they arrived. Most families settled in for the evening meal. Quinn left Margaret at the boarding house steps, tipping his hat in farewell. As he rode back toward his ranch, he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, a lightness that had been absent for so long he had almost forgotten what hope felt like. The next morning, Quinn woke before dawn as always and worked through his usual routine of checking cattle, mending fence, and tending to the dozen tasks that kept a ranch running. But his mind kept returning to Margaret, to the intelligence in her eyes and the quiet determination in her voice. He found himself working faster than usual, eager to finish in time to make the ride to town. By noon, he had cleaned up and changed into his better shirt, the one without patches or permanent stains. He caught his reflection in the small mirror he used for shaving and barely recognized the anticipation in his own expression. This was foolish, he told himself. They had spoken for a few hours. She was a stranger. But logic held no power against the certainty he felt that Margaret Oakes was important, that their meeting under his oak tree meant something. Margaret was waiting on the boarding house porch when he arrived, wearing a different dress, but with the same leather-bound book tucked under her arm. Her face lit up when she saw him, and Quinn felt that unfamiliar lightness expand in his chest. "Punctual," she observed, accepting his hand to step down. "I appreciate that in a person." "You brought the Byron," Quinn noted. "I bring it everywhere." Margaret fell into step beside him as they walked toward the edge of town. It was Thomas's. He saved for months to buy it, used his wages from working at the shipyard. He gave it to me the week before he got too sick to leave his bed. Quinn wanted to take her hand but settled for offering his arm instead. "He must have loved you very much. We were all each other had, really. Our parents were not cruel, but they were distant. Thomas and I made our own family." Margaret's voice carried old grief, worn smooth by time but still present. "I think he would have liked you." They walked beyond Sweetwater's scattered buildings to where a creek wound through cottonwood trees, the water running clear and cold from mountain snowmelt. Quinn had discovered this spot his first year in Wyoming and came here when he needed to think. He had never shown it to anyone else. "It is beautiful," Margaret said softly, taking in the play of light on water, the rustling leaves, the vast sky overhead. "Thank you for sharing this with me." They sat on the creek bank, and Margaret opened her book but did not read, simply held it like a talisman. Quinn picked up a smooth stone and sent it skipping across the water's surface, watching the concentric circles spread and fade. "Tell me about your ranch," Margaret said. "What made you choose that particular piece of land?" "The oak tree, mostly." Quinn found another stone. "When I first came to Wyoming, I worked for other ranchers, saved every penny. I was looking for land to buy, something I could afford, and most of what was available was either too exposed or had no water source. Then I found that section with the oak tree, and it felt right. The tree has been there longer than any settlement in this territory. It felt like something worth building around. Like it had permanence in a place where everything else shifts and changes," Margaret said, understanding immediately. "Exactly." Quinn looked at her, struck again by how easily she grasped things he had never been able to articulate. That tree has survived droughts and blizzards and probably Indian raids before any white settlers arrived. It has roots deep enough to hold. And you wanted roots. Margaret met his gaze. After leaving your family, you needed to belong somewhere. The insight was accurate enough to sting. Is it that obvious? Only to someone looking for the same thing. Margaret tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture Quinn was already beginning to recognize as unconscious habit. I have been adrift since Thomas died. Teaching gave me purpose for a while, but it was not enough. The bookshop was better, but I was still living someone else's vision of what my life should be. Coming here, it feels like I might finally have the chance to put down my own roots. What would that look like? Quinn asked. Your vision, I mean. What do you want to build? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching the creek flow past. Something honest. Work that matters, whether it is teaching children or keeping accounts or helping run a business. A home eventually, but one I have a hand in creating, not just managing. And someone who sees me as a partner, not an ornament or a servant. That does not seem like too much to ask. You would be surprised how many people find it excessive. Margaret's smile was wry. My mother was horrified that I wanted to do accounts at the bookshop. She said it was unladylike to think about numbers and money. But I found I had a talent for it, and there was satisfaction in making the ledgers balance, in seeing the business run more efficiently because of improvements I suggested. Quinn thought about the ranch accounts he managed himself, the careful calculations required to decide when to sell cattle, what supplies to purchase, how to allocate limited resources. I could use someone with a head for figures, he said, then immediately worried that sounded like he was proposing employment rather than expressing interest, but Margaret's expression brightened. Could you really? I would love to see how a ranch operates, understand the economics of it. It is not glamorous work, Quinn warned. Mostly it is tracking expenses and trying to predict markets that are impossible to predict. But yes, if you are genuinely interested, I would be glad to show you. They talked until the sun began its descent toward the mountains, and Quinn realized with a start that he had spent the entire afternoon by the creek without noticing the passage of time. Margaret seemed equally surprised when he pointed out the lengthening shadows. I should get you back to town, he said reluctantly, though I find myself wishing for longer days. Tomorrow, Margaret asked hopefully, could I visit the ranch? I promise not to be a nuisance, and I truly would like to understand how it all works. Quinn knew he should be more cautious, should not rush into anything with a woman he had known for barely 2 days. But caution felt like cowardice in the face of what he was beginning to feel. Come for breakfast, he heard himself say. I start early, but if you do not mind the hour, you can see the full daily routine. What time is early? I will be at the boarding house at 5. Margaret did not even blink. I will be ready. Quinn rode back to the ranch that evening with his mind full of possibilities he had long since stopped allowing himself to consider. He had accepted loneliness as the price of independence, convinced himself that he was content with solitude. But Margaret's presence had awakened something he thought he had buried, a longing for partnership and connection that went beyond mere physical attraction. True to her word, Margaret was waiting when Quinn arrived at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house the next morning, dressed in a simple skirt and shirtwaist more practical than her previous dresses. She had braided her hair in a single plait down her back, and Quinn thought she looked more beautiful than any woman he had ever seen. The ride to the ranch passed in comfortable conversation, Margaret asking questions about the land, the cattle, the challenges of Wyoming weather. Her interest seemed genuine rather than polite, and Quinn found himself explaining things in more detail than he normally would, enjoying her quick understanding and thoughtful observations. At the ranch, he showed her everything, from the morning routine of checking cattle to the process of mending tack to the account books, where he tracked every expense and sale. Margaret examined the ledgers with the focused attention she had given her Byron, her finger tracing down columns of numbers. "You are undercharging for your beef," she said after a few minutes of study. "Based on the market prices you have recorded from Cheyenne, you could ask at least 15% more and still be competitive." Quinn looked over her shoulder at the figures. "I was trying to keep costs down for local buyers." "Which is admirable, but you are barely breaking even after expenses." Margaret tapped a page. "You could create a tiered system, lower prices for Sweetwater families who buy small quantities, standard rates for the larger buyers who can afford it. That way you help your neighbors without undercutting your own viability." It was a simple solution, obvious now that she had pointed it out. Quinn felt a mixture of chagrin at missing it himself and admiration for how quickly she had identified the problem. "You have a talent for this." "I like making things work better," Margaret said simply. "Thomas used to say I saw patterns others missed. He meant it as a compliment, though my mother considered it further evidence of my unwomanly nature." "Your mother was wrong." Quinn said it with enough force that Margaret looked up in surprise. "Intelligence is not unwomanly. Neither is competence or having opinions or being good with numbers. Those are human qualities, and anyone who suggests otherwise is selling a lie to keep people in their place." Margaret's eyes shone with sudden emotion. "Thank you for saying that. It is only the truth." Quinn wanted to say more, to tell her that he found her remarkable, that every moment in her company convinced him further that finding her under his oak tree was the most important thing that had ever happened to him. But the words felt too large, too soon, so he settled for asking, "Would you like to see the rest of the ranch?" They spent the morning riding the property line, Quinn pointing out landmarks and explaining his plans for expansion. Margaret listened attentively, asking questions that showed she was thinking beyond the immediate moment to future possibilities. By the time they returned to the ranch house, the sun was high and hot, and Quinn's stomach was reminding him that he had forgotten breakfast in his eagerness to collect Margaret from town. "I have bread and cheese," he offered, "and some jam Mrs. Patterson made from wild berries. It is not fancy, but it is filling. It sounds perfect." Margaret helped him set out the simple meal, moving around the kitchen with an ease that suggested she was comfortable with domestic work, despite her education and Eastern background. They ate sitting on the porch, watching the heat shimmer across the grassland. "I love it here," Margaret said quietly. "The openness of it. In Boston, I always felt confined, like the buildings were pressing in from all sides. Here you can see for miles. It makes everything seem possible." "It can also make you feel very small," Quinn admitted. "Especially during winter, when the wind comes down from the mountains and reminds you how fragile human settlements really are. But you stay." "I stay because this is where I chose to build my life." "That choice matters more than comfort or convenience." Quinn set down his plate, gathering courage. "Margaret, I know we have only just met, but I need to tell you something." She turned to face him fully, her expression open and attentive. "I am listening. When I found you under that oak tree, reading in the afternoon heat, something shifted for me. I have spent 5 years building this ranch, telling myself that work and independence were enough. But these past few days with you have shown me what I have been missing." He took a breath, aware that he was taking a risk but unable to stop himself. "You make me want things I thought I had given up on: partnership, conversation that challenges me, a future that includes another person." Margaret's hand found his, her fingers warm and steady. "I feel it too. I came to Wyoming hoping for a fresh start, but I did not expect to find someone who understood me so quickly, who sees what I can offer rather than what I am supposed to be." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I have been alone for so long, Quinn. Even before Thomas died, I was isolated by being different, by wanting things women are not supposed to want. But with you, I feel like I can finally be myself." Quinn turned his hand to lace his fingers through hers, his heart pounding so hard he was certain she must be able to hear it. "Stay," he said. "Not just for today, but truly. Stay in Wyoming, let me court you properly, give us a chance to see if this feeling between us is as real as I think it is." "You want to court me?" Margaret's smile was radiant. "Even knowing that I am stubborn and opinionated and terrible at being the kind of feminine ideal society expects. Especially knowing that." Quinn raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a promise. "I do not want an ideal. I want you, exactly as you are." The weeks that followed were the happiest Quinn could remember. Margaret visited the ranch nearly every day, sometimes helping with accounts, sometimes simply reading under the oak tree while Quinn worked nearby. They talked endlessly, discovering shared opinions and arguing cheerfully over differences, learning each other's stories and dreams and fears. Mrs. Henderson watched their developing relationship with obvious approval, though she cautioned Margaret about propriety. "People will talk," she warned. "An unmarried woman spending so much time alone with a man." "Let them talk," Margaret replied, though she was careful to return to town before dark and never stayed overnight at the ranch. "Quinn treats me with more respect than most of the supposedly proper men I knew in Boston." And it was true. Quinn was unfailingly respectful, never pushing for more than Margaret was willing to give. They held hands while walking, and he kissed her cheek in farewell, but he never presumed or demanded. The restraint was actually harder than if he had been pushing for more, because it made Margaret want to close the distance between them, to pull him close and damn the conventions that said she should wait. 6 weeks after their first meeting, Quinn rode into town on a Saturday afternoon and asked to speak with Margaret privately. Mrs. Henderson raised an eyebrow but allowed them to use her small parlor, leaving the door conspicuously open. "I have been thinking," Quinn began, then stopped, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Actually, I have been thinking of little else for weeks now. Margaret, you have become essential to me, not just helpful with the ranch, though you are, but essential to my happiness. I wake up looking forward to seeing you, and the days you cannot visit feel empty and wrong." Margaret's heart began to race. "Quinn, please let me finish before I lose my nerve." He took both her hands in his. "I know it has only been a few weeks, and by all reasonable standards we should wait longer. But I am 36 years old, and I know my own mind. I love you, Margaret Oakes. I love your intelligence and your passion and your terrible habit of reading in impossible locations. I love how you see possibilities where others see only problems. I love the way you challenge me and comfort me and make me believe in futures I had stopped imagining." Tears were streaming down Margaret's face now, but she was smiling. "I love you too, so much that it frightens me sometimes." "Then marry me." Quinn's voice shook slightly. "Not because it is proper or because people expect it, but because I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up next to you and fall asleep talking about the day. I want to give you a home where you can be exactly who you are, no pretending or conforming required. I want us to be partners in every sense, building something together that neither of us could create alone." "Yes," Margaret did not hesitate. "Yes, absolutely yes." Quinn pulled her into his arms, holding her tight enough that she could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. "I do not have a ring yet. I wanted to ask first, make sure you would even consider it before I spent the money. I do not need a ring." Margaret pulled back just enough to see his face. "I just need you." But when Quinn kissed her, finally and thoroughly, Margaret decided that while she might not need a ring, she definitely needed more of this. His lips were warm and slightly chapped from the wind, and he kissed her like she was precious and vital, and everything he had claimed she was. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat loudly from the doorway. "I assume congratulations are in order." The older woman's expression was knowing. "We are engaged," Margaret confirmed, unable to stop smiling. "We are going to be married." "About time," Mrs. Henderson said with satisfaction. "When is the wedding?" Quinn looked at Margaret. "As soon as possible. I see no reason to wait if you do not." "Neither do I." Margaret felt giddy with happiness and possibility. How quickly can these things be arranged in Wyoming? "The circuit minister comes through Sweetwater once a month," Mrs. Henderson supplied. "He is due back in 2 weeks. If you can wait that long, he can perform the ceremony." 2 weeks felt like an eternity, and no time at all. Margaret wrote to her parents, informing them of her engagement but not requesting their blessing, knowing they would disapprove regardless. Quinn sold several head of cattle to buy a simple gold band and commissioned the town carpenter to add 2 rooms to the ranch house, wanting Margaret to have proper space. The wedding was held under the oak tree, with most of Sweetwater in attendance. Margaret wore a new dress in pale green, and Quinn wore his best suit, purchased for the occasion. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Quinn kissed Margaret with a tenderness that made several of the watching women sigh. The wedding celebration continued at the boarding house, with food and music and dancing that lasted until evening. But finally, Quinn and Margaret were able to slip away, riding together to the ranch that was now their shared home. "Are you nervous?" Quinn asked as they approached the house, the windows glowing with lamplight he had left burning earlier. "A little," Margaret admitted, "but mostly I am happy. Happier than I thought possible." Quinn helped her dismount and then swept her into his arms, carrying her across the threshold in a gesture that was both traditional and sweetly romantic. Inside, he set her down gently and just looked at her for a long moment. "What are you thinking?" Margaret asked softly. "That I am the luckiest man in Wyoming territory." Quinn cupped her face in his hands. "That I cannot believe you chose me." "There was no choice involved," Margaret said, rising on her toes to kiss him. "From the moment I saw you ride up to that oak tree, some part of me recognized you. Like I had been waiting without knowing what I was waiting for, and then suddenly there you were." They made love that night with a combination of tenderness and passion that left them both breathless and amazed. Afterwards, lying tangled together in Quinn's bed that was now their bed, Margaret felt a sense of rightness so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "What is wrong?" Quinn asked immediately, concern in his voice. "Nothing is wrong. Everything is right." Margaret turned in his arms to face him. "For the first time in my life, everything is exactly right." The early months of their marriage were an adjustment as they learned to share space and merge their lives. Margaret proved to be competent at ranch work when needed, unafraid of hard labor despite her Eastern upbringing. Quinn discovered that having a partner made both work and leisure more enjoyable, that discussing decisions and sharing burdens made everything easier. Margaret took over managing the ranch accounts entirely, her systematic approach and sharp eye for patterns quickly improving their financial situation. She also began tutoring children from nearby ranches, charging minimal fees but finding satisfaction in teaching young minds to question and explore. Their first winter together was brutal, with blizzards that lasted days and temperatures that dropped so low the livestock needed constant monitoring. But huddled together by the fireplace, reading aloud to each other or simply talking while the wind howled outside. Quinn and Margaret both felt blessed rather than burdened. "Tell me again about the bookshop," Quinn said one evening. Margaret nestled against his side while snow piled against the windows. "Why? I have told you a dozen times already. Because I like hearing about your life before we met. I want to know every part of you." Quinn pressed a kiss to her hair. "And because your voice is soothing." So Margaret told him again about the dusty little shop in Boston, the smell of leather and paper, the satisfaction of organizing inventory and managing accounts. And Quinn told her again about his early days in Wyoming, working for other ranchers and saving every penny, dreaming of his own land. These stories became their shared mythology, the past they carried into their future. When spring finally arrived and the snow melted, revealing the tough prairie grass beneath, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She told Quinn one evening after dinner, when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I think we are going to have a baby." Quinn went very still. "You think?" "I am fairly certain. All the signs are there." Margaret watched his face, trying to gauge his reaction. They had not specifically discussed children, though both had assumed it would happen eventually. "How do you feel about it?" Quinn asked carefully. "Terrified," Margaret admitted, "and happy and worried about 100 things, but mostly happy." Quinn pulled her into his lap, holding her close. "We are going to be parents." "Apparently so." Margaret rested her head against his shoulder. "Are you pleased?" "I am more than pleased. I am overjoyed." Quinn's hand settled on her still flat stomach. "Though I am also terrified and worried about 100 things." They laughed together, the shared anxiety making it seem less overwhelming. Over the following months, as Margaret's pregnancy progressed, they prepared as best they could. Quinn built a cradle from oak wood, sanding it smooth so there would be no splinters. Margaret sewed tiny clothes and read every book she could find on childbirth and infant care. The nearest doctor was in Cheyenne, too far to reach easily, so they made arrangements with Mrs. Patterson, who had delivered several babies, and agreed to attend Margaret when her time came. As summer deepened and Margaret grew larger and more uncomfortable, Quinn became increasingly protective, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work. "I am pregnant, not fragile," Margaret protested when he insisted she stay inside on a particularly hot day. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of humanity. I think I can manage light chores." "Humor me," Quinn said, bringing her water and fanning her with a folded newspaper. "I have never done this before, and I am discovering I am terrible at watching you be uncomfortable without trying to fix it." Margaret softened, reaching up to touch his face. "You are going to be a wonderful father." The baby came in early September, a long, difficult labor that left Quinn pacing anxiously while Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Henderson attended Margaret. When he finally heard the baby's first cry, followed by Margaret's exhausted laugh, he nearly collapsed with relief. "You can come in now, Mrs. Henderson called, and Quinn entered the bedroom to find Margaret propped against pillows, sweaty and pale but smiling, a tiny bundle in her arms. "Meet your son," she said softly. Quinn approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe. The baby was impossibly small, red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists waving in the air. "A boy," he whispered. "I hope you do not mind." Margaret's voice was exhausted but content. "I know some men prefer daughters." "I do not mind anything except that you are both healthy and safe." Quinn sat carefully on the edge of the bed, reaching out to touch the baby's impossibly tiny hand. The infant's fingers immediately closed around his, gripping with surprising strength. "Hello, little one. I am your father." "What should we name him?" Margaret asked. They had discussed names but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son's face, Quinn thought of his brother who had died young, before the family business turned his father bitter and grasping. "Thomas," he said, "if you would like. After your brother." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Thomas Quinn Taggert, it is perfect. Fatherhood transformed Quinn in ways he had not anticipated. He was already familiar with responsibility and hard work, but caring for Thomas brought a new dimension of purpose to his life. Every decision now factored in his son's future. Every improvement to the ranch was made with an eye toward what he would leave behind. Margaret adapted to motherhood with characteristic determination, reading everything she could find and developing her own theories about child rearing that often contradicted conventional wisdom. She insisted on nursing Thomas herself, despite suggestions that they hire a wet nurse, and she refused to bind him tightly in swaddling clothes, believing babies needed freedom to move. "People are going to think we are raising a wild child," Quinn observed one evening, watching Margaret let Thomas kick freely on a blanket while she read beside him. "People can think what they like," Margaret replied serenely. "Thomas is healthy and happy. That matters more than conforming to customs that may or may not be beneficial." As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered under Margaret's management and Quinn's hard work. They expanded their herd, built additional outbuildings, and even hired 2 ranch hands to help with the increasing workload. Margaret continued teaching, now bringing students to the ranch for lessons, and her reputation for producing literate, thinking children grew throughout the region. When Thomas was 3, Margaret became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect, and in the spring of 1882 she delivered a daughter they named Sarah, after Quinn's mother who had died when he was young. "Now we have one of each," Margaret said, exhausted but radiant as she held their daughter while Thomas peered curiously at his new sister. "Our family feels complete." Quinn agreed, though he would have been happy with whatever children they were blessed with. What mattered was not the number or gender but the love that filled their home, the sense of building something meaningful together. The years passed with the rhythm of ranch life, seasons turning and children growing. Thomas proved to be adventurous and curious, always exploring and asking endless questions. Sarah was quieter but equally intelligent, with a gift for drawing and an uncanny ability to understand animals. When Thomas was 8 and Sarah 5, a severe drought hit Wyoming. Cattle died by the hundreds across the territory, water sources dried up, and many ranchers faced ruin. Quinn and Margaret survived largely because of their careful financial management and Margaret's insistence on maintaining reserves, but it was a near thing. "We need to diversify," Margaret said one evening, reviewing their diminished accounts. "Relying solely on cattle is too risky. If we add sheep, maybe some horses, we would have multiple income sources. Cattle ranchers and sheep ranchers do not mix well in this territory," Quinn warned. "There has already been violence over grazing rights. Then we need to be smart about it. Keep the operations separate, maybe run sheep on the northern section where the grass is different anyway." Margaret tapped her pencil against the ledger. "I am not suggesting we abandon cattle, just that we need to think beyond single-crop dependency." Quinn trusted his wife's judgment, so they acquired a small flock of sheep and hired a shepherd who knew how to manage them. Margaret proved right as usual. The diversification helped stabilize their income, and careful management of their different herds prevented the conflicts that plagued other ranchers. As the children grew older, both showed interest in different aspects of ranch life. Thomas loved working with the cattle, riding alongside Quinn and learning to rope and brand. Sarah preferred the sheep, spending hours watching them graze and sketching their movements. Margaret encouraged both children to pursue their interests while also insisting they maintain their education. "We cannot afford to send them back east for schooling," Quinn said when Thomas turned 12 and began talking about seeing more of the world. "Then we bring education here," Margaret replied. She had been corresponding with former colleagues in Boston, and through those connections, she assembled a library of advanced texts and materials. Both children studied mathematics, literature, history, and science under their mother's demanding tutelage. When Sarah was 10, she announced that she wanted to be a veterinarian. The idea was shocking, as veterinary medicine was almost exclusively male, but Margaret immediately began researching what training would be required. "If our daughter wants to heal animals, she should have that opportunity," Margaret told Quinn when he expressed concern about the obstacles Sarah would face. "I agree," Quinn said. "I just worry about her being disappointed when she discovers how few schools will accept female students." "Then we will find the ones that will." Margaret's jaw set in the stubborn line Quinn had learned to recognize. "The world is changing, Quinn. Slowly, but it is changing. By the time Sarah is old enough for veterinary school, there may be more opportunities than there are now." True to her word, Margaret began preparing Sarah for a future in veterinary medicine, teaching her anatomy from books and arranging for her to assist the traveling veterinarian who served the region. The man was initially skeptical but quickly recognized Sarah's talent and became one of her strongest supporters. Thomas, meanwhile, showed an aptitude for business that matched his mother's. By age 15, he was helping manage ranch accounts and had started a side venture buying and selling horses. He had his father's integrity and his mother's head for numbers, a combination that served him well. In 1892, when Thomas was 19 and Sarah 16, Wyoming achieved statehood. The change brought new regulations and opportunities, and the Taggert Ranch was well positioned to benefit from both. Thomas traveled to Cheyenne to represent the family at various meetings, while Sarah continued her studies with single-minded determination. That fall, Sarah was accepted to the veterinary program at Iowa State College, one of the few institutions that admitted women. The whole family traveled to see her off, Quinn fighting tears as he hugged his daughter goodbye. "I am so proud of you," he told her. "Prouder than you can possibly know." "I learned from the best," Sarah replied, including both parents in her smile. "You taught me that being different is not the same as being wrong, and that determination matters more than other people's expectations." With Sarah away at school and Thomas increasingly involved in the business side of the ranch, Quinn and Margaret found themselves with more time alone together. They were in their early 40s now, their bodies showing the wear of hard years, but the love between them had only deepened with time. One evening, sitting under the oak tree where they had first met, Margaret leaned against Quinn's shoulder and sighed contentedly. "Do you ever regret it? Marrying so quickly, building a life so far from civilization?" "Never." Quinn's arm tightened around her. "You are the best decision I ever made. This life we built together is more than I dreamed possible when I left Missouri." "I think about that sometimes," Margaret mused. "About how many small choices led to us finding each other. If I had not come west, if I had not asked Mrs. Henderson about good men in the territory, if I had not decided to wait under that particular tree." "I think we would have found each other somehow," Quinn said. "Some things are simply meant to be." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and purple. The ranch stretched around them, solid and prosperous, a testament to years of shared work and vision. In the distance, they could hear Thomas calling in the cattle, his voice strong and confident. "We did well," Margaret said softly. "Despite everything, we built something good. We did better than well." Quinn kissed the top of her head. "We built a life worth living." The years continued to pass, marked by the small triumphs and challenges of daily life. Sarah graduated from veterinary school at the top of her class and returned to Wyoming to establish a practice, becoming the first female veterinarian in the state. Thomas married a schoolteacher named Clara and brought her to live at the ranch, expanding the house once more to accommodate the growing family. Quinn and Margaret became grandparents when Thomas and Clara welcomed a daughter in 1895, followed by twin boys 2 years later. Sarah remained unmarried, devoted to her practice, though she maintained a close friendship with a female doctor in Cheyenne that Margaret suspected was more than simple friendship, but never pressed her about. In 1898, on their 20th wedding anniversary, Quinn took Margaret back to the oak tree and presented her with a leather-bound journal. "What is this?" she asked, turning the blank pages. "I thought you might want to write our story," Quinn explained, "so that Thomas and Sarah and their children will know how we began. How a stubborn cowboy found a stubborn woman reading under his tree and had the good sense to convince her to stay." Margaret laughed, the sound as bright and youthful as it had been 2 decades earlier. "I was not the one who needed convincing, as I recall. You were the one worried about propriety and moving too fast. Only until I kissed you. After that, I would have married you the same day if you had agreed." They made love under the oak tree that evening, middle-aged and comfortable with each other in ways that brought its own deep satisfaction. Afterwards, lying in Quinn's arms with the stars emerging overhead, Margaret felt the same contentment she had experienced on their wedding night, the sense that everything was exactly as it should be. The new century arrived with celebrations throughout Wyoming. Quinn was 54, Margaret 49, and both feeling the accumulation of hard years in their joints and muscles. But the ranch remained prosperous under Thomas's increasingly capable management, and they were able to step back from daily operations, spending more time with grandchildren and pursuing interests they had deferred during the building years. Margaret finally wrote her book on education reform, drawing on decades of experience teaching frontier children. It was published by a small press in Cheyenne and became required reading for teachers throughout Wyoming. Quinn built furniture in a workshop he constructed behind the house, his pieces sought after for their quality and craftsmanship. In 1905, Sarah shocked everyone by arriving at the ranch with a woman she introduced as her partner, a doctor named Elizabeth, whom she had met during a medical conference. Margaret welcomed Elizabeth warmly, while Quinn struggled briefly with his own assumptions before recognizing that his daughter's happiness mattered more than conventional expectations. "I am sorry if this disappoints you," Sarah said privately to her parents. "You could never disappoint us," Margaret said firmly. "We raised you to be true to yourself. That has to include being honest about who you love." "Your mother is right," Quinn added, "though I will admit I am still adjusting to the idea." "Not because it is wrong," he hastened to add, seeing Sarah's expression, "but because I am an old man set in my ways. Give me time and I will get there." True to his word, Quinn soon came to appreciate Elizabeth, who was intelligent and kind and obviously devoted to Sarah. The two women established a household in Cheyenne, where they both practiced medicine, visiting the ranch regularly and becoming beloved aunts to Thomas's children. The grandchildren were Quinn's greatest joy in his later years. He taught them to ride and rope, passed on stories of the early days in Wyoming, and spoiled them shamelessly. Margaret was more practical but equally devoted, ensuring they received good educations and exposing them to books and ideas beyond the ranch. In 1910, Quinn's health began to fail. He had developed a persistent cough that would not respond to treatment, and he tired easily. Sarah insisted he see specialists in Cheyenne, but the diagnosis was grim: consumption, the same disease that had claimed Margaret's brother decades earlier. "How long?" Quinn asked the doctor directly. "Difficult to say. Months, perhaps a year if you are fortunate." Quinn took the news calmly, more concerned about Margaret's reaction than his own fate. He was 62 years old and had lived a full life, built something lasting, loved and been loved deeply. There were worse ways to face death. Margaret took it harder, railing against the unfairness even as she threw herself into his care. "You do not get to leave me," she told him fiercely. "We have more years together. We are supposed to grow old watching grandchildren grow up." "We did grow old together," Quinn pointed out gently. "And we have watched grandchildren grow. Some people never get what we have had, Margaret. We have been blessed beyond measure." But he fought anyway for her sake, determined to squeeze every possible day from whatever time remained. Sarah moved back to the ranch temporarily to help with his care, and Thomas took over all ranch operations, allowing Margaret to focus entirely on Quinn. They spent long afternoons under the oak tree, Quinn reclining in a chair Margaret had set up with blankets and pillows. Sometimes they talked, remembering their years together. Sometimes Margaret read aloud from Byron or Whitman or whatever book she had brought. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, finding peace in each other's presence. "Read the beginning of our journal," Quinn requested one autumn afternoon, when the leaves were turning gold and his breathing had become more labored. Margaret retrieved the leather-bound book she had filled over the years and opened to the first page. Quinn Taggert had not expected to find anyone beneath the sprawling oak tree that stood at the edge of his property. She read, her voice catching slightly. Especially not a woman in a pale blue dress reading a leather-bound book as if she had been waiting there her whole life. "I was waiting," Margaret said, closing the book. "I did not know it consciously, but I was waiting for you, and then there you were. Best day of my life," Quinn whispered. "Seeing you there, knowing somehow that everything was about to change." Winter arrived early that year, snow falling in November. Quinn grew weaker, confined to bed, but his mind remained sharp until near the end. On a clear December morning, with Margaret beside him and both children present, Quinn Taggert closed his eyes and stopped breathing, his hand still holding his wife's. Margaret sat with him for a long time after, memorizing his face, feeling the absence of his presence like a physical wound. Finally, Thomas gently convinced her to step away, to let them prepare his father's body for burial. They buried Quinn under the oak tree, as he had requested. The entire community of Sweetwater attended, along with friends and business associates from across Wyoming. Person after person spoke of Quinn's integrity, his fairness, his dedication to family and community. But Margaret knew the truth that lived beneath those public virtues. He had been a man who loved completely, who built something meaningful from nothing, who believed in her when society said she should be something different. The months after Quinn's death were the hardest of Margaret's life, harder even than losing Thomas, her brother, because she had built her entire adult existence around partnership with Quinn. Everything reminded her of him. The ranch they had built together, the furniture he had crafted, the worn spot on the porch where he always stood to watch the sunset. But she had his children and grandchildren, and the work of managing the ranch accounts that Quinn had always trusted to her judgment. Slowly, painfully, she found her way back to something resembling equilibrium. She would never stop missing him, but she learned to carry the grief alongside the joy of their years together. Sarah and Elizabeth offered to have Margaret come live with them in Cheyenne, but she refused. "This ranch is my home," she said. "Quinn and I built it together, and I am not ready to leave it. Perhaps I never will be." Instead, she threw herself into writing, producing a memoir of frontier life that was published to modest success. She also established a lending library in Sweetwater, donating many of her own books and soliciting contributions from others. It was named the Thomas Quinn Memorial Library, honoring both her brother and her husband. Margaret lived another 12 years after Quinn's death, remaining sharp and engaged until the end. She saw her grandchildren grow to adulthood, saw Sarah's veterinary practice flourish, saw Thomas transform the ranch into one of the most successful operations in Wyoming. She held great-grandchildren and passed on stories of the early days, ensuring that the family history was preserved. In the spring of 1922, at age 71, Margaret suffered a stroke while working in the garden she had planted decades earlier. Thomas found her slumped beside the tomato plants, still holding her trowel. She died 3 days later without regaining consciousness, surrounded by family. They buried her beside Quinn under the oak tree, her grave marked with a simple headstone that read, "Margaret Oakes Taggert, 1851–1922. Beloved wife, mother, and teacher, she chose her own path." The ranch remained in the family for generations, each successive Taggert adding to what Quinn and Margaret had built. The oak tree continued to stand, its thick trunk marked with the initials QT and MO that Quinn had carved during their 10th anniversary. It became a family tradition for couples to be married under its branches, continuing a legacy of love and partnership that began with a cowboy finding a woman reading in the afternoon heat. Thomas's daughter, the one born in 1895, eventually wrote a comprehensive family history based on Margaret's journals and the stories she had collected from aging relatives. In the introduction, she wrote, "My grandparents' love story reminds us that the greatest adventures often begin with simple moments of recognition. A man rides up to his favorite tree and finds a woman waiting, though neither knew they were searching." From that brief encounter came decades of partnership, children and grandchildren, and a legacy that continues to shape our family today. They built something lasting not through grand gestures, but through daily choice to honor their commitment and support each other's growth. In doing so, they created a love story worthy of the West, hard-fought, honestly earned, and built to endure. The oak tree still stands on the Taggert Ranch, now in its 4th century of life. The ranch house has been expanded and modernized, but the core structure Quinn built remains. Sweetwater has grown from a frontier town to a thriving small city, but the library Margaret founded still serves the community. And on summer afternoons, if you visit the tree where it all began, you can almost see them. A cowboy and a woman reading, finding each other across the years, proving that some love stories are indeed meant to be. Their great-great-grandchildren still work the land, still read beneath that oak tree, still tell the story of how it all began. Because some legacies are more than property or possessions. Some legacies are about the example of a life well lived, a love honestly built, and the courage to choose your own path, even when society says you should conform. Quinn found Margaret beneath his oak tree, and she had indeed been waiting for someone like him, though neither could have articulated what they needed until they found it in each other. Together they built not just a ranch or a family, but a testament to what becomes possible when two people choose partnership over convention, honesty over ease, and love over loneliness. Their story became legend in Wyoming, not because it was exceptional in its events, but because it was exceptional in its authenticity. They loved completely, worked honestly, and built something that endured long after they were gone. And perhaps that is the truest measure of a life well lived. Not what you accumulate, but what you create together, the love you share, and the legacy you leave for those who come after. Quinn and Margaret understood this instinctively, building their life together with care and intention, never taking for granted the miracle of having found each other beneath that oak tree on a hot July afternoon in 1878. Their love story became the foundation for generations of Taggerts who followed, each couple adding their own chapter while honoring the partnership that began it all. In the end, that is perhaps the greatest gift they gave their descendants, not just land or success, but an example of what love looks like when it is built on respect, sustained by effort, and deepened by the countless small choices that transform two individuals into something greater than either could have been alone.